Welcome back to the Emotional Communication Podcast, where we help ambitious, logical people communicate emotionally and communicate effectively. This is not just about expressing whatever you feel or saying whatever comes to mind. It's actually about communicating in light of what other people are feeling. And we're going to dive into all of those practical tools, how we do that. But first, what this episode is on is the science of emotional communication and really the science of emotions and decision making. And years ago, I prided myself on being a very logical person. Now, at this point in time, if I had to lose the ability to think logically or lose the ability to feel emotionally, hands down, I would lose the ability to think logically. It is way more important to have the ability to feel emotionally, just to be a functioning person in life. And we're going to explain exactly that, why I would say that, and what the science is in this episode. Let's get right into it. You might have noticed if you're watching on YouTube here, or you're watching the video version, my co-host Taylor is not with us today. I had a speaking engagement during our regular time when we would normally record, and so we weren't able to record together this week, but the show goes on. So he'll be back in the next episode. But let's dive into the science of emotional communication, and let me give you a little background on myself. My bachelor's degree is in statistics, and if you know much about STEM fields, particularly if you've been a graduate student or you've done any kind of research, almost always there is a statistical component of any science-related research, to the point where statisticians are almost the police of the science world. In my undergraduate, I did an internship with this consulting group on the campus I was part of. And what they did is they were a bunch of statisticians who did consulting for other graduate students working on their master's or PhD, and basically helping them make sure that they're understanding what the numbers mean and not drawing conclusions that weren't supported by their data. And that's really what a lot of statisticians do, is they're holding people back. A lot of people I've talked to have the common view that statistics is just sort of making stuff up. Statisticians are trying to make sure that other people don't draw conclusions that aren't supported. And they're almost like the police of the scientific world. So that was the background, and that gave me a lot of the ability to understand what research was and really understand the nuances of things and see things as more of an evidence-based world rather than black and white. So it made a lot of discovering the science on this more fun. But let me read a quote right here to sum this up, to kind of get this kicked off. This was spoken, or I think it was in an interview by a guy named Shiv. He was a Stanford Marketing Professor, and he said this in November of 2020, so somewhat recently, depending on when you're listening to this. And when he said this quote, he was summarizing a lot of research. So this wasn't sort of a one-off, one expert thinks this. It was really the culmination of a lot of science, a lot of research, and many other experts would share the same opinion. Here's what he said. He said, the fundamental premise, this is based on all the evidence out there, that most of human decisions and human behaviors are shaped by emotion and not by reason. And then, if you ask me to put a number to this, based on all of the evidence out there, I would conjecture something like 90 to 95% of our decisions, our behaviors, are constantly being shaped non-consciously by the emotional brain system. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. What Shiv was getting at was something that made no sense to me, or would have made no sense to me several years ago. And what I thought he meant by an emotional decision was completely different than what I now understand to be emotional decisions. Here's what I originally thought an emotional decision was. I thought it was sort of like an impulse buy, where someone is going, they know, okay, I probably don't need this thing. I probably can't afford it, but I just kind of want it. And they choose to buy whatever the item is. And in that case, the emotional decision was opposed to what would seem to be the logical decision. And that, in my mind, was what most emotional decisions were. It was where I know what to do. There's a logical conclusion. There's a better option, yet we choose not to do that better option in favor of whatever feels right at the time. That's what I thought. And while those certainly are emotional decisions, that's not the most of emotional decisions that Shiv was talking about. Most of the emotional decisions we make are actually far more subtle. They're far more sneaky, if you will, to the point where or we don't even realize that they're emotional decisions because of just how our brain works. And so I'm going to introduce a framework that Daniel Kahneman put out. Daniel Kahneman, absolutely brilliant social psychologist, won the Nobel Prize actually in economics for what was known as prospect theory. And he put all of this out. You can actually read a summary of what he wrote in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. We'll put also the description of that in the show notes. And I realized as we explain some of the science on this, if you are like a neuroscientist or somebody who's done a lot of the research, very familiar with this, I'm going to make some simplifications that are helpful just to understand this. But I realize there's a little bit more nuance to this. So these are slightly simplified science from here. But here's what Daniel Kahneman introduced. He introduced this paradigm where there are these two systems in our brain that are constantly running. And they would notice all these things like certain pupils dilating when one of the systems was working. They would notice these actual physical changes. But he said that they were helpful to think of as two characters. And so I like to think of these, even though he calls them System 1 and System 2, I like to call them Thing 1 and Thing 2. This is almost like they're Dr. Seuss characters. And you have Thing 1 and Thing 2, everybody has them, and they're running around in your brain and they're making decisions. But Thing 1 and Thing 2 are completely different. Thing 1 is always on. Thing 1 is impulsive. Thing 1 is fast. Thing 1 is emotional. Thing 1 is automatic. And Thing 1 takes no effort to run. If Thing 1 were a college student, Thing 1 would probably be the college student who was like a party kid, who's out partying when they want to, and then they're working hard on their studies when they want to, and then they're off doing this. Thing 1 doesn't operate logically. Thing 1 operates mostly intuitively or emotionally. If Thing 1 was in one or two classes where the professor happened to wear a tie and they got a bad grade in the classes, Thing 1 would just say, oh, I saw the professor wears a tie and I got a bad grade. That must mean when a professor wears a tie, I get a bad grade. And even though there's not really logic behind that, when we really break it down and think about it, doesn't really make sense that what someone wears would contribute to the grade that someone would get in their class. There's probably not a strong logical connection there. Thing 1 doesn't operate based on logic. Thing 1 operates just based on relationships. So once that relationship is established, they walk into the next class, the professor has a tie, and Thing 1 automatically thinks, I'm going to get a bad grade in this class. So the point is, that's how Thing 1 works. Thing 1 is automatic, and it is largely what we would think of as the emotional brain system. Obviously, Daniel Kahneman points out that there's a lot more to it than that, but Thing 1 is kind of the emotional character. Thing 2 is totally different. Thing 2 is effortful. Thing 2 takes a lot of energy to run. Thing 2 is very logical. And if Thing 2 were sort of a college student, Thing 2 would be like a tired nerd. They would be the person who can figure out any problem. They can solve it. Nobody sort of pulls a fast one on them. They always are able to figure it out. However, they don't want to do work. They're very lazy. Thing 2 doesn't want to operate. And so Thing 1 and Thing 2 are in everybody's brain. And if you kind of want to experience what it feels like to be using each brain system, we have a little exercise here. And I would recommend doing this if you want to kind of feel what this is like. So none of these are trick questions. None of them are gotchas. They're very just simple questions with very simple answers. So first of all, if somebody were to ask you and say, what's 1 + 1? 2. What color is a cherry? Red. When we immediately have those questions, we probably did not have to think at all about the answers. They just immediately came. It was very fast and easy, and we were correct. That was Thing 1 or System 1 operating. Thing 1 just immediately pulled up the answer. When somebody asked us what color cherry was, we immediately had the picture in our mind of a red cherry, and boom, it was that simple. That was Thing 1. Now, here's what Thing 2 feels like. Unless you have like a PhD or a master's degree in math, or you're really good at multiplying, in that case, there might be a Thing 1 thing. But for most people, this question is going to be a Thing 2 thing. So no calculators allowed, no pen and paper. You have to do this in your head. What is 37 times 18? Do that. What's 37 times 18? Now, if you were to go through, maybe even pause the podcast to do this, I don't even remember what it is. And it would take me a little bit to figure out. But here's what happens when you start working on that math problem. Immediately, it's very difficult to think about and focus on that math problem and think about other things at the same time. So you start to almost have a little bit of like tunnel vision where you're not thinking about the other things now. And you think about, okay, how do I multiply the 8 times the 37 first? Maybe I do 20 times 40, and then I kind of back solve or add up. And so what's happening is you're having to kind of remember certain pieces of information and do other things. And that is taking a lot of work for your brain. And it doesn't quite give you a headache per se, but if you did that for an hour, it might. And so that was a thing 2 or system 2 process. It was way harder, took way more work. However, it was completely logical. And those are the two systems, the two things we have in our brains all the time. Thing 1, largely emotional. Thing 2, largely logical. Imagine if every decision took as much work and as much brain power as multiplying 18 times 37. Imagine if you woke up in the morning and in order to decide if you wanted eggs or bacon for breakfast, that was how hard you had to think. Or if you walk into a room and there's 2 different people you want to talk to and you have to decide which one you're going to talk to first, if that was how hard you had to think, what would happen is we would not be able to make many decisions. We'd be very, very overwhelmed by all of the logic having to go in. So in general, our brain does not prefer to use thing 2 because there's so much work that goes into it. Our brain prefers the much lower energy, easier thing 1, where we just make a fast emotional decision and we can roll with it. So you wake up and you're like, today I want eggs, or today I want avocado toast. And it's very simple. And that in and of itself is actually the emotionally formed decision. However, it's not devoid of logic because as soon as we make an emotionally formed decision, our brains immediately kick in. And thing 2, because it's lazy, will allow thing 1 to make the decision. But then because thing 2 needs a logical justification, thing 2 will come up with a piece of logic to justify it. So for instance, if that day we decided, hey, eggs are the thing I want to eat, well, maybe thing 1 says, I just feel like eating eggs. Thing 2 says, I need to find a logical decision for that. Well, eggs have protein in them. So I was getting some really good protein. It's a very balanced fat source. This is perfect. That's why I'm eating it. So in our brains, there's actually a piece of logic attached to the emotional decision we made. So if somebody were to ask us, hey, why did you choose to eat the eggs? We would give them the logic and we would say, well, because of the protein and because of that. Oftentimes we will return the logical reason that thing 2 came up with after the decision was already made. And so the logic sometimes isn't the actual reason. It was just the logic that our brain came up with. Same with if, let's say we had chosen the avocado toast that morning. Maybe instead of saying, it was protein because all of a sudden that reason doesn't work as well, we would say, well, avocados are very well-balanced fruit. I don't think they're a fruit, vegetable, whatever they are. They're very well balanced. It's a good fat source. There's some good micronutrients. And we would come up with that as a reason, even though the decision was already made emotionally. The best way to kind of understand or think about this process I've thought about is if you've ever seen those political debates on Facebook. Someone will already have a political position determined. They'll already decide they're for or against a certain candidate. And then when someone else provides logical evidence that would go against emotionally where they're at, a lot of times people will go and they'll Google and find other studies or evidence that justify or back up what they already believe. And they'll present that and they'll present a logical evidence, but really they just found the logic that backed up what they already believed emotionally. That is what is happening on most of the decisions we make. And it's so sneaky because if we were to ask ourselves why we made a decision, most of the time, thing 2 will give us the logical reason back, even though that may or may not be the real reason. We go back to the college example. Let's say thing 1 has had a couple classes with professors who wear ties and they got a bad grade. And there's really not, it just kind of so happened randomly that the professors who wore the ties happened to be the ones that got the bad grades. And there's no actual causal or logical connection between those two. But thing 1 created one. And if you were to ask, well, why do you think it is that professors with ties give you bad grades? That person would probably respond with some kind of reason. And they might say something like, well, the people who wear ties are the older ones and they're just grouchy and they don't really care about the students. Or they might say something like, well, the professors who don't wear ties are more laid back, and so they care. They're not so stuck up on grades. Whatever. They might generate all sorts of different logical reasons, but in reality, all of those reasons were come up with after the fact. They're not the real reasons. And so that's the interesting thing about emotions and logic in all of our brains is most people, myself included, think that we're actually forming these decisions logically when almost all of them were made intuitively, emotionally beforehand, and then the logical reasons were just added. And that again was, and maybe if you don't agree with that, feel free to take it up with Daniel Kahneman, and he did a really, really good job of pointing this out. So if we summarize all of that, it was that most decisions are made emotionally, then justified logically. And that isn't actually a bad thing. That could seem like a really bad thing, like people are just getting manipulated, they don't know what they're doing. But in reality, that is so efficient of our brains because most of the decisions we don't need to logic all the way out. The other thing is, logic actually falls short in a lot of situations in order to be able to make decisions. There's a crazy fascinating study where they looked at a guy, and it was more of a case study. There was a gentleman where they ended up cutting certain parts of his brain in order to combat seizures and slow down seizures going on. And then it so happened that the parts of his brain were in between a part of the brain that communicated, that thought more logically, and a part of the brain that thought more emotionally. Now, obviously, I realize that's a simplification. Our brains are not so simple as to say, this is just the emotional piece, this is just the logical piece. It's a little more nuanced than that. However, that was what happened is they cut these parts of the brain, and they noticed some very interesting things happening with this guy. If you ask him to compare two things, like ask him, hey, what are the pros and cons of going to this restaurant for dinner versus this restaurant? Restaurant A, and he had no problems coming up with, okay, in restaurant A, the food's better, but the drive's a little bit longer, and restaurant B, well, the drive's 10 minutes shorter, but I don't quite like the food as much. It's still good, but not quite as much. This guy could come up with all sorts of different reasons, pros and cons, why he might lean towards one or another. And that was not a problem because that was the logical process. But then when he was asked to actually make a decision about which restaurant he would want to go to, that was very, very difficult for him to do. He couldn't actually make the decision between the two restaurants. Here's why. When you start to think about logically between those two restaurants, again, one, the food's better, one, the drive is closer, how do you compare which one is logically the better choice between better food and a shorter drive? Well, the answer is it depends. Because these are not an apples to apples comparison, this is an apples to oranges comparison. Drive time and food quality are not the same thing. We can't assign like a number to each, or maybe you can, but it begins to get very difficult to logically solve for which one is correct. And so our logical brains will fall short of comparisons where things are not completely logical. But our emotional brains don't have this problem. Our emotional brains have no problem comparing things that can't be compared. They can handle apples to oranges comparison. So emotionally, we'll think about the two restaurants and we'll just feel a different way about a certain one and we'll be able to actually make the decision. So emotions actually allow us to make decisions that logic can't. And that is where emotions are so powerful. That is why I would get rid of the logic in my brain way before I get rid of the emotions, because if I had logic but not emotions, I wouldn't be able to make decisions. But if I had emotions, I could still make decisions, even if they weren't the best ones. And that gets down to the word. The word emotion, very simply, is just the word motion with an E in front of it. That's what emotions do, is they put us in motion, or some emotions like fear, for instance, stop us in our tracks and keep us from being in motion, oftentimes trying to keep us from making a bad decision. But that is the role of emotions, is they get us unstuck and allow us to actually make decisions. Without emotions, This is where some people get stuck in what's known as analysis paralysis, where it's all logic. We're all coming up with here's the pros and cons, and there's all this analysis, but there isn't an actual decision made. There's no emotion in it. And that's what emotions are doing. So how does all of this relate to communication? Here's how all of this relates. Those two things, thing one and thing two, thing one being emotional, thing two being logical. Thing one operates way faster. It's always on, and it detects emotional reasons way faster than the logic of thing two can compute and can come up with. This means that whenever you or I are communicating to someone, they're picking up on the emotions of our message faster than they're picking up on the logic of the message. So we could say all the right words and logically convey the right thing, but even before that, they're already picking up on the emotions and building an emotional response and making an emotional decision based on what we're saying, even before the logic has computed. And why that's so important is if we're in conversations and we miss that and we just assume, okay, people are going to listen to the logic, we're already missing the boat. They're already making their decisions and they're justifying it with different logic. You've probably experienced moments where someone comes to give you really, really good news or really bad news, and you can already tell if the news is going to be good or bad before they even tell you the news. There's just something about the way they walk or the way they look or how they start to speak that you already know what's coming. You've had those sentences where someone calls you and they say, hey man, I love this, I love this, I love this. And as they're saying that, you know that there's about to be a but it's not going to work out. You already know that's coming. You can sense it. You can feel it. Other people have that sense too. And they know that when we're communicating, what we communicate emotionally is hitting faster and their brain's making decisions based off of that faster even before the logic. So this isn't even, the skill of emotional communication isn't even a skill that's just learning how to manipulate people's emotions. That's not it at all, because emotions are actually really, really good at detecting manipulation. People are really good at detecting inconsistencies between different indicators. And so emotional communication isn't how do I trick someone into thinking that I mean one thing when I don't. That's not it at all. It's actually about aligning the emotions of your message behind the logic. That's the really important part. And with that, as people are making these emotional decisions, most of them are spot on and they're very correct and they're very helpful and useful. And that's why I've come to respect emotions and appreciate emotions far more than I used to. So as we get into the specific tools of this is how we communicate emotionally, the entire goal is communicating to both the thing one part of the brain that is making a very fast emotional decision, the same thing that we're communicating to the thing two, the logical part of the brain. And really the three areas in communication we focus on are just same as the acronym BTW. Some people say, by the way, they'll just write BTW in a text. Same thing, it's body language, tone, and word choice. And largely body language communicates how we're feeling. It communicates a lot of indicators of how comfortable I am, how nervous I am. All of those things come through the body language. Tone communicates intention in a lot of ways. Most of the time, tone gives someone an indicator of what we actually mean and the intent of why we're saying something. And finally, word choice can change sort of the softness or hardness of what we say, and it actually communicates different in the precision of different things. And we're going to get into all of those details beforehand, but recognizing that this is how all of our brains are working is we have this very fast, emotional, quick decisions, and then a slower logical justification behind it. And that's how everybody's working. So the best communicators communicate emotionally correctly first, and then give the good logic that follows behind it. It's the exact same way conflict is diffused. If you start with the logic first, a lot of times we've completely missed the conflict and it blows up even worse. This is where you'll watch people get into, or you've experienced this yourself. Someone will go into sort of a problem solving thing, or you'll go into problem solving thing with someone, and then it seems like people are even behaving more irrationally. They're not behaving rationally at all. They're just blowing up even more, and then conflict's escalating. That's because emotionally what's coming across and logically are two different things. And so we always start with diffusing the emotions first, and then get down to the logic. Same thing happens in persuasion. It's not about just giving someone a bunch of reasons. If every telemarketer that called just came in and said, hey, here are all the reasons you should buy this, we would be very resistant to them because we don't actually believe that they have our best interests in mind. So we don't actually even believe what they say. And all of that's an emotional defense mechanism. And that works really well. It's the same thing in romantic relationships and people who are, taking somebody out on a date or going on a date with someone. A lot of times, people do not go on dates. There's probably someone out there who does this, but people don't go on dates and say, all right, here's my logical criteria on why I'm going to be a great wife or a great husband or what I'm looking for in a relationship. Here it is. Is yours the same? If they match up, we'll keep going. That's not what we do at all. What we do is we go on dates and there's flirting and there's connection and there's getting down to how someone feels about something. And there's all of those little things. Those are all the emotional indicators first. And then once those are sort of satisfied, then somebody looks for the logical, okay, does this line up? Does this line up? Does this line up? And those things happen. So that is almost always the way our world works, is there's an emotional layer first and then the logical layer second. And those are how those are connected. So as we communicate, we don't want to disregard the logic at all. It's just not the primary thing. It's the secondary part. Okay, I hope this is helpful. We're going to put more notes in the description of some of the science that I shared and quoted, just hitting the tip of the iceberg on that. But I hope this gives you a different paradigm for thinking about how emotions work, what they're doing for each of us, how helpful they are, and how important they are in communication. And next week, we're going to dive into actually getting into some specific tools on how do we actually start to address that emotional layer of decision making and communicate that way. Thanks for joining the Emotional Communication Podcast.